A serene town is abruptly shaken when police uncover a hidden tunnel beneath Shaquille O'Neal's opulent mansion. Late-night truck arrivals spark whispers, yet no one dares to ask. What secrets lie within the home of this celebrated basketball icon? As the investigation progresses, shocking truths emerge, unraveling the community's trust. Deep underground, a concealed passageway holds unimaginable secrets. Shaq, beloved for his kind heart and iconic status, suddenly becomes the subject of suspicion. The unfolding enigma forces the townspeople to make a difficult choice. Do they stand by Shaquille O'Neal, or confront a reality that challenges everything they believed about their cherished neighbor? The story unfolds. On a sunny afternoon in the peaceful town of Springfield, the serenity of the day was abruptly shattered by the blaring sirens of police cars echoing down the street. Curious neighbors heard the rising sound, growing louder as though the police were on a mission and heading straight toward the heart of the neighborhood. The sirens grew louder as two patrol cars sped past, heading toward the large mansion on the block. The residents quickly realized where the convoy was headed, the lavish estate of Shaquille O'Neal. They peered cautiously through curtains and windows, unable to believe their eyes as the scene unfolded. The cars came to a stop in front of Shaq's gate, surrounding the legendary house. Whispers spread, and everyone wondered why the police were at Shaq's house. Some stood still, staring through their windows, while others ventured outside to get a better look at the unfolding disruption. Officers exited their cars and made their way swiftly to the front door. One of them knocked forcefully, their voice stern and resolute. "Mr. O'Neal, please come outside. We have a search warrant." Moments later, Shaquille O'Neal appeared at the door, towering over the officers but maintaining his calm demeanor. He greeted them politely, his deep voice rising above the whispers from the crowd. Neighbors watched intently, observing the interaction between Shaq and the police. He nodded and stepped aside, allowing the officers entry. It was a shocking scene, yet for some residents, it wasn't entirely surprising. Over the past 4 months, strange events had been unfolding at Shaq's estate, leaving the once peaceful community unsettled. Every night, exactly at midnight, large trucks would arrive and stay until morning, with workers in gloves and masks moving hurriedly, as though racing against time. No one knew what they were transporting or why, but the mystery was unsettling. As if the nighttime activities weren't strange enough, the odd occurrences intensified during the day. At least once a week, smaller trucks would roll up, carrying large containers. The workers operated quickly and methodically, bringing in seemingly empty boxes, only for them to emerge much heavier. No one could fathom what was being moved in and out of the mansion. At first, the neighbors kept silent. They prided themselves on respecting each other's privacy and were careful not to interfere in anyone's personal affairs. They quietly observed the bizarre happenings at Shaq's house without a single word spoken. Everyone noticed, but no one dared ask any questions. Until it got worse. Strange beams of light began emanating from the mansion in the dead of night. "What's going on?" the neighbors murmured, exchanging worried glances. For 2 weeks straight, these strange lights appeared, flashing briefly before disappearing. Then, an unbearable stench began to waft through the neighborhood. It seemed to come from the vicinity of Shaq's property, but no one could pinpoint exactly where it was originating. At this point, the community's anxiety was palpable. The strange events were becoming too numerous to ignore. Finally, the residents decided to take action. They organized a meeting, and after much discussion, they elected a group of respected town members to visit Shaquille O'Neal and express their concerns. On a bright morning, this group stood at the front door of Shaq's mansion. Though apprehensive, they were determined. When the basketball legend opened the door, one member of the group stepped forward, his voice polite yet firm. "Good morning, Mr. O'Neal. We apologize for coming unannounced, but this is an urgent matter." Shaquille O'Neal, ever the gracious host, invited them inside and offered refreshments. However, the guests politely declined. They weren't there for pleasantries. "Mr. O'Neal," one member began cautiously, "we've noticed some unusual events happening at your home. Other residents are feeling concerned, so we wanted to check in and see if everything is all right." The words hung in the air, heavy with tension. The neighbors held their breath, waiting for Shaq's response, unsure of what they would hear, but desperately hoping for some clarity. Shaq smiled gently and replied, "I understand your concerns, gentlemen, and I sincerely apologize for any disturbances. But I assure you, everything is fine. There is nothing to worry about." His voice was calm, but the unease in the air was palpable, impossible to hide. The guests exchanged skeptical glances, clearly not fully convinced. They had hoped for a clearer explanation that would quell the growing anxiety of the residents. After a moment of silence, they nodded reluctantly. "All right, we'll be going now," one of them said, rising to his feet. Shaq apologized once more for the disturbance and escorted them to the door. He watched them as they walked away, their figures slowly disappearing in the fading light of the evening. When they were out of sight, he let out a heavy "T." The last thing he wanted was to draw attention to his home, but somehow, he had failed in that regard. As the group returned home, they conveyed what Shaq had said. Some were satisfied with his explanation and wanted to move on, but others remained doubtful. Leading the charge was Mrs. Janet, whose sharp tone and unwavering expression made her stand out. "This is ridiculous," she exclaimed, her face creased with disdain. "There's definitely something going on over there." A wave of murmurs rippled through the group. Many frowned or exchanged knowing glances. Mrs. Janet was well known for her tendency to exaggerate matters, and her relentless determination to pry into other people's business had become legendary. She was a wealthy woman, living just 3 houses down from Shaq's mansion. She was convinced that Shaq was hiding something dark. The rumors of her suspicions spread quickly through the neighborhood: fraud, smuggling, illegal trafficking. She held nothing back, letting her imagination run wild as she planted seeds of doubt in the minds of others. From her perspective, Mrs. Janet had been quietly observing Shaq's home, searching for any sign that might confirm her theories. Her distrust was nothing new. It had been forged through the scars of personal pain. After 3 divorces, she no longer trusted anyone. She believed everyone had a hidden agenda, either to exploit her or deceive her. Her first marriage ended in betrayal. Her husband had cheated on her, and when she confronted him, he blamed her for being too demanding and controlling. His love had faded, and he left her for someone else. That bitter experience marked the beginning of her lifelong mistrust, and her subsequent failed marriages only deepened her skepticism. Her second marriage ended because of her own insecurities. Obsessed with the betrayal of her first husband, she became overly suspicious of her new husband. Every message or phone call from him was a source of anxiety. She would constantly try to uncover who was on the other end of the line, always assuming he was hiding something. Her husband, frustrated by her lack of trust, tried to calm her fears, but she refused to listen. Her paranoia led her to falsely accuse him of infidelity and demand a divorce. Only after they parted ways did she discover he had been completely innocent. Her third marriage was even shorter, lasting less than a year. This time, the betrayal was real. Her husband had lied about his wealth, and when she uncovered the truth, she wasted no time in kicking him out. She was furious that he had married her for money. This experience left her disillusioned, no longer believing in marriage. Her mistrust deepened, and suspicion of everyone became second nature. When Shaq moved into the neighborhood, Mrs. Janet couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss about him. She was determined to uncover the truth, quietly keeping an eye on his house whenever the opportunity arose. Mrs. Janet became obsessed with the trucks coming and going, straining her eyes to see what they were carrying, but her efforts proved fruitless. The lack of concrete evidence only fueled her frustration, and her growing disappointment intensified her resolve. When the residents decided to confront Shaq, she had hoped they would finally uncover the truth, but his vague reassurances left her unsatisfied. She decided to take matters into her own hands. Resolute, she continued to monitor his home more closely. Weeks passed without any breakthroughs, and her patience began to wear thin. One night, just as she was about to give up and go to bed, something happened. She heard voices, raised voices, coming from Shaq's house. Her heart began to race as she rushed outside. In the dim light, she could make out 2 figures, their arms flailing as they appeared to be in a heated argument. Straining to catch their words, she could only make out fragments, the rest lost to the night's thick cover. However, one brief exchange reached her ears. "The boss won't like this," he was very clear. The frustration in Mrs. Janet only grew as the rest of the conversation remained indecipherable. Still, that fragment was enough to ignite a spark of suspicion in her. Clearly, they were talking about something secretive, something that seemed to involve Shaq. That night, Mrs. Janet tossed and turned in bed, piecing together what she had overheard and plotting her next move. The resolve in her heart only deepened. She was more determined than ever to uncover what was truly happening at Shaq's house. By morning, she had made up her mind. She would use the events of the previous night to uncover the truth. She spent the entire day planning, and by evening she was ready to act. Shaq had a predictable routine. Every evening he went for a run down the street, turning around at the end, running back about 7 times before finishing. That evening, Mrs. Janet decided she would join him. Shaq was surprised when she unexpectedly appeared, running alongside him. Before he could say anything, she bluntly stated, "I know you're hiding something, and I'm going to find out what it is." Her voice was sharp, filled with determination. Shaq glanced at her, his expression calm, betraying no emotion. "Yes, you're right," he replied flatly, his voice cold and almost dismissive. It was his lack of reaction that only fueled her irritation. She tried to provoke him, throwing out sharp words and accusations, hoping he might slip up or reveal something. But Shaq remained unfazed, either ignoring her or offering gentle warnings to be cautious while running. Eventually, Mrs. Janet realized she wasn't getting anywhere. Frustrated and out of breath, she gave up, turning back toward her house, seething with anger. Sitting down, she began to rethink, and new ideas began to form. Wouldn't confess, she would force his secrets to be exposed another way. Determined, she picked up her phone and made several calls. Once done, she leaned back on her sofa, a satisfied smile playing on her lips. Her plan was in motion, and she couldn't wait to see how it would unfold. She was certain that it wouldn't be long before Shaq's true nature would be revealed. As night fell, her plan began to take shape. The sound of police sirens grew louder as they approached Shaq's house. Mrs. Janet looked out the window, her heart pounding with excitement as the police cars turned into Shaq's driveway. She couldn't suppress her thrill, eager to get closer to the unfolding events. She stepped outside and introduced herself to one of the officers. By now, several curious neighbors had gathered, eager to know what was going on. Whispers and speculation filled the air as they tried to guess what might be happening. The officers knocked on Shaq's door, and he opened it as calmly as always. Mrs. Janet, along with a few other inquisitive neighbors, followed the police inside. She was determined to uncover whatever this mysterious neighbor was hiding. Shaq them through his expansive home, his demeanor as composed as ever, unaffected by the presence of the police and the crowd. The air was thick with anticipation as they moved from room to room. Everyone hoped to discover some dark secret. Finally, Shaq stopped before a door, opened it, and revealed a staircase leading down to the basement. All eyes were on him as he gestured for them to follow. What lay beneath, everyone thought, would expose the truth. At least, that's what they hoped. Silence fell as they reached the bottom, their eyes wide with disbelief when Shaq stopped before a heavy door at the far end of the basement. He paused, taking a deep breath before opening it. The sight inside left them stunned. A brightly lit hallway stretched before them, leading to a massive aquarium, where fish swam gracefully, peacefully. Confusion and unease spread through the group. This was certainly not what anyone had expected. One officer looked around, his expression one of bewilderment, while the neighbors exchanged weary glances. Sensing their disorientation, Shaq began to explain about his aquarium. He said that it had been built to provide food for local homeless shelters. He presented a special permit he had received from the county to breed and sell the fish, as well as all the necessary permits for building the aquarium and installing lighting in the basement. He explained that trucks arrived every night to collect the fish, which were prepared and delivered to the shelter the following morning. The mysterious glow emanating from Shaq's underground fish tank had aroused considerable curiosity. The shallowness of the tank and the transparent tunnels allowed the light to escape, while the high-end LED lights, designed to simulate natural cycles and promote healthy fish growth, also added to the brilliance. As Shaq continued his story, he revealed that he had discovered the unused underground space when he first moved in and decided to turn it into something meaningful. Seeing the struggles of the homeless in the area, especially at the nearby shelter, he wanted to help without drawing attention to himself. The fish tank became his way of contributing to the community, doing good without seeking recognition. The earlier unpleasant odor was also explained. Shaq clarified that the pollution had killed all the fish, leaving behind a foul smell that lingered for several days. He sincerely apologized for the inconvenience caused to the neighborhood. Shaq's decision to keep the project a secret stemmed from his desire to focus on its purpose rather than seeking fame. He recounted meeting a homeless woman whose story deeply moved. She had fled an abusive marriage and ended up on the streets, with no family or support system. Her daily struggle to survive prompted Shaq to take action in his quiet way. "Oh, we truly apologize for barging in like this," one of the officers spoke, his tone full of regret. Shaq offered a comforting smile. "It's all right," he replied, leading them to the door. Mrs. Janet stood still, her mind spinning as she tried to find the right words. Meanwhile, the other residents approached Shaq, their faces filled with remorse. They apologized for having suspected and hastily judged his actions. Shaq waved them off gently. "If I were in your shoes, I would have done the same," he said with a kind smile. "You were just concerned about your safety, and that's completely understandable." The residents slowly dispersed, returning to their homes. Only Shaq and Mrs. Janet remained standing there, in the quiet of the night. I don't know what to say," Mrs. Janet whispered. Shaq's smile widened. "Come visit me tomorrow," he said. "I want to show you something." Without waiting for a response, he turned and walked toward his house, leaving Mrs. Janet standing there, her mind swirling with confusion and curiosity. When she returned home, the shock lingered. That night, she stayed up, replaying everything that had happened, her heart heavy as she realized she had been wrong about Shaq. The next morning, curiosity overtook her. She found herself standing in front of his house, eager yet hesitant. Shaq greeted her with a warm smile and led her to his car. They drove in silence until they arrived at a small shelter. Mrs. Janet's eyes widened in disbelief at the sight before her. A long line of people, their faces weary, were patiently waiting for their turn to receive food from a modest stall near the shelter. "These people have had enough to worry about," Shaq said. "The least I can do is make sure they're not hungry." Mrs. Janet's chest tightened as she witnessed Shaq's selfless kindness. She felt something shift within her. The doubt and protective stance she had once held seemed insignificant in the face of his generosity. She held back tears as they left, and from that moment on, her perspective changed forever. Shaq turned to Mrs. Janet and smiled, his eyes filled with empathy. "We don't have to do something grand to make a difference. Sometimes it's the small things as long as they come from the heart," he said warmly. Mrs. Janet nodded, her heart brimming with emotion. "You've reminded me that when we open our hearts and believe in kindness, the world becomes a better place." From that day on, Mrs. Janet not only changed her perception of Shaq but also transformed how she viewed the world around her. Through small but meaningful actions, she realized that kindness could spread, turning lives of hardship into stories of hope. She began volunteering at the shelter, finding joy in helping others. Gradually, she started to see the beauty of the world and the kindness of people that she hadn't noticed before. Shaq's compassion had ignited something special within her, and together, they created a legacy of kindness and change, proving that even the smallest acts of goodness can lead to profound transformation. This story reminds us of the power of compassion and the change that can come from small actions. Have you ever had the chance to help someone or change your perspective on someone else? Share your thoughts and story in the comments. Your voice could inspire and spread kindness to others. If you found this story meaningful, don't hesitate to share it with friends and family to spread the message of change and compassion. Thank you for following and supporting. Keep taking action to create positive changes in your life every day. Wishing you endless joy and energy. Thank you for supporting the channel. Please like, share, and subscribe to receive the latest updates. The stories are collected from various sources and do not represent any individual or organization. They are shared with the intention of spreading human values in life and have been rewritten with the support of AI. If there are any mistakes, kindly overlook them with understanding. Wishing you all the best in life.